Welcome to tonight's Code with Jason meetup. The topic this evening will be how to plan a software project. I was mentioning about 10 seconds ago that a very common problem with developers is that they dive in and start implementing things before they've actually decided what they're going to do. Everyone has been taught over and over that waterfall style development is bad. Big design up front is bad. And those things aren't wrong. But people are maybe taking too strong of a takeaway. They hear no big design up front. And so that translates to just no planning anything ever. And that's not what that means. It just means don't try to plan a whole year's worth of development in advance. Maybe you can try to plan your next week or your next month or something like that with varying degrees of specificity. But anyway, people here don't do big design up front, and then they just do almost no planning at all. So I want to talk a little bit about that. It's a gigantic topic, one that could span quite a number of these sessions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go, I'm going to get started, and you guys can feel free to interrupt me at any time, either verbally or put something in the chat if you like. And we can take this in any direction we feel like makes sense. There's only 3 of us, so it'll be pretty easy to just kind of go with the flow, I think. And maybe a good prompt is my friend / client Ryan sent me some questions earlier today, and I told him that I would address some of these questions tonight and then upload the recording later. We're going to jump around a little bit here, but Ryan's first question is, how do you plan a project in such a way that it can be released in smaller chunks when you are fundamentally changing large chunks of functionality? Let me reread that. How do you plan a project in such a way that it can be released in smaller chunks when you are fundamentally changing large chunks of functionality? Yeah, okay. So this brings me to a great point. Everything is connected to everything else. And technical decisions are not separable from business decisions, at least not always. And like broad scale project planning is certainly one of those things where that's often the case. When I start planning a project, I think about the release right from the very beginning, because there's not only the question of what's the scope of this project going to be, what's the content going to be, all that stuff, how do we tackle it? It's also, how do we get this project into production in a successful way? And I found that the best way to get a project into production successfully is to do it in small parts. If you do a big release, the more stuff there is to go wrong. So if you're releasing a bunch of code at once, if you're making a bunch of big changes in one go, the more stuff there is to go wrong. It's just kind of common sense. But what's not so obvious maybe is how you achieve that, because there's a number of obstacles to that. It's not so easy necessarily to just take a big project and slice it up into smaller parts and deploy those smaller parts. So let's talk about a couple of those strategies. The reason I say everything's connected to everything else, and it can be a business decision too, is because if you identify a project that is valuable at the business level, it might not coincide with a project that is realistic and sufficiently unrisky at a technical level. So you have to slice it up. but it might be the kind of thing where it's kind of what's the word? It's one singular thing, and it's either valuable all at once or it's not valuable at all. You can't release it in a partway finished state. And so what I like to do in those scenarios is this. With the business stakeholder or whatever, we together we conceive of the project as we ultimately desire it. We don't give much consideration to technical concerns. We just ask the question, what do we want? Not, is this realistic to achieve or anything like that? It's too many things to think about at once. So we come up with what we ultimately want, plan that out in some level of detail, and then we say, okay, this is what we ultimately want, but this is too big to do as a single project. So maybe we can take this, and rather than like vertically slicing it up or horizontally slicing it up, maybe we can think of it as a circle and slice it up in like concentric circles. So this is the ultimate desired end functionality. Can we take a kernel of utility that has standalone value and deploy just that? And in my experience, there quite often is something that's at least smaller than that initial thing. And so we say, okay, rather than dividing this up into like features and stuff like that and deploying feature 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then put it all live, let's take this whole thing and get the core of it that gives us maybe 80% of the value for 20% of the work, or whatever it may be. Let's get that out there in production, in users' hands, get the feedback loop started, and then we can expand outwardly from there. So that's one kind of strategy. It doesn't work all the time, but it at least works a lot of the time. I'll pause there and see if there's any comments or discussion or anything. Okay.
One thing that this sounds like is you're talking about a project that's large, but a lot of times it could be additional stuff. I look a lot of times think about things of whether they're compatible or incompatible.
Yeah.
And try and make things as much as a compatible change as possible. So like if you have like addresses or something like that, and it used to be a table in your database where you had an address as a set of columns on one table, and then you said, oh, we need to have multiple addresses. You could break that out and then, but make that be something that you can be a compatible change where you're able to keep. So if you have new functionality that requires multiple addresses and old functionality that expected only a single address, you can do stuff where for today you break out the table, but then you have an accessor that says, just give me the first one, which means that you can do the complicated model changes in a way that's compatible with the new system and the old system.
Yes. Yeah, I agree so much. Yeah, and I think that's even like more what Ryan was getting at, is rather than a brand new thing that isn't dependent on anything else that came before, or like a brand new thing that's purely additive, how do you do those projects that are like a change to something existing? And I would completely agree with everything you just said. The other thing that I would say is like, so there's kind of two things in my mind. There's like backward and forward compatibility and the idea of parallelism. And I think the idea of backward and forward compatibility is like basically always a good idea, and it's usually possible. And the parallelization idea is something that maybe applies sometimes and sometimes doesn't. But for example, at my last job where I worked for a medical clinic, we migrated from one set of several off-the-shelf systems to a smaller set of off-the-shelf systems and one custom system that kind of took the place of several of these old ones. rather than having a hard cutover where one day we flipped a switch and everything was different, we ran the old system and the new system in parallel. It was a lot more work to do it that way, but it was much safer because at any time, if we decided the new system wasn't ready for prime time, it wasn't the end of the world, we could just continue that parallel usage of the old system that we had been doing. And of course, after a period of time, we had sufficient confidence in the new system that we said, okay, we feel like it's reasonably safe now to discontinue usage of the old system and rely only on the new system. Okay, let's see. I'm going to actually read Ryan's same question one more time to see how well we feel like we answered it. How do you plan a project in such a way that it can be released in smaller chunks when you are fundamentally changing large chunks of functionality? I'll say a couple more things actually. So to continue to riff off of your point, Jonathan, about I struggle with how to put this, the backward / forward compatibility thing, because that's the idea, is to like make it so the thing you're adding, it's like it's a thing like this. It's like you have the way it is now, and then you add something that's compatible with that old one, and then also compatible with this newer one, and you go in steps like that. I don't
That's
know an
really about
actual
like
verbal way to say it.
de-risking. It's kind of like de-risking the transition.
Yeah. Yeah. And a part of that we haven't said yet is like, okay, let's consider 3 states. You have the old, okay, maybe it's actually 2 states, but you have the original state. I know that for sure. And then you have, yeah, it's 3 states. Okay. You have the original state, and you have the state at which the new functionality is completely live and being used by everybody. And in between those 2 states, you have this third state where the new functionality is present, but not yet live. And so the idea is that you have this original state, you add the new functionality, but don't turn it on yet. And then you turn it on. And this middle thing that you added, that has to be compatible with both the original state and this new state where everything's turned on. Because then if you do it that way, among other benefits, if you do it that way, if things go sideways and you decide, oh no, we made a mistake, let's revert, you can just turn it off. And since it's compatible with the original way, not just the new way, then it's not that big of a deal to roll back. Would you add anything to that, Jonathan?
I would just give kind of as an example of where that's done well, or where that could be done well, is if you have something where you have like the version 2 user interface where it's optional, where you can you have beta access to the interface and you can turn it on and off, because then the user could even be switching between the old state and the future state whenever they choose. So your system has to be able to show, for people who want to use the old interface, they have to still work. But then if you want to go to the new beta interface, or once they finally switch over to final, then either they can check off that box or hit that button and be using version 1 or version 2 of the user interface.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Something that makes me think about is the possible objection that doing it that way would be so much more expensive than just adding the new stuff and making the new stuff go away. And that's certainly true. It's probably more than twice, not probably, like it's definitely more than twice as expensive to do it that way, where you have both going in parallel. But it's also like maybe not more expensive, because like what's actually more expensive, doing all this extra work so you can have a smooth transition, or not having a smooth transition and having a big disaster and all that, you have to recover from it and all that stuff, like that's really expensive. So even though it's more expensive to take those risk mitigating measures, I think that on average, it's probably way cheaper.
Well, and that's the thing. A lot of these conversations really kind of end up centering around is risk mitigation. The nice thing, if you're having that like that complete parallelism where you can just toggle between them, is that means that on day one of the project, you can give special users a feature flag where they can do that, and you can start pushing that stuff out on day one, and kind of not wait till having that big merge at the end of the project or something like that, where you had to bring it all in and hope that you've tested every edge case and have that confidence. You can kind of have that. What it means is that your integration is really easy because you've been integrating the whole time, as opposed to a big bang at the end or something like that, and hoping your testing process works.
Yeah, and one of my readers commented after one of my most recent emails, because I sent an email like yesterday. I sent an email yesterday where I had some advice for how to achieve stable deployments. And he's like, Jason, you really danced around the topic of continuous delivery without ever saying continuous delivery. And it's funny because the term continuous delivery didn't even occur to me, but that's totally what I was describing. And yeah, one of the big benefits of continuous integration and continuous delivery is that you're only ever making small changes, and you're doing them frequently. So at any time something goes wrong, it's usually a pretty small thing. Not only is it a small thing that goes wrong, but it's easy to identify what that thing is. There's nothing worse than releasing like 3 months worth of miscellaneous features, and then something goes wrong and you don't know what it is, and you have to dig through all that stuff to try to find it. That's not good. Yeah.
When you said that, it makes me think sometimes we release things and it doesn't actually get tested for 3 months. Like no one's actually using it in the wild.
Mhm.
And so we started planning releases for, like, our business has kind of a cycle in the year, right? There's a renewal, there's a membership, there's credit issuing, there's a bunch of stuff, there's payments. So whenever we're touching a feature in that area, we try to do it, at least a month ahead of that cycle happening, but at least we know as soon as it's going to get tested, fairly quickly. Now, obviously our members, like our administrators test it, but it's different having all of your 6,000 or 8,000 members touching the thing instead of like a couple people testing, a couple of accounts. So it was harder to go back after 3 months. You want to deliver it at a time where it's going to get the usage that you need to make sure that it's stable. And having that, you don't want an outage, and you definitely don't want an outage for long. But you do have to have that, ability to respond to a potential outage quickly, but also know that it's going to get, it's going to get seen. Yeah, that's one of the things. Now, I have a question for you, Jason.
Yeah.
What happens when, you were talking about slicing up this functionality into circles? What happens when they're like those circles, you can slice them up, but there's still, tendrils touching other pieces, right? Like you have a circle, but there's still a function that has to go outside of that circle. What do? Do you isolate it and like stub it out, or like, make a ghost function that pretends like it's working?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to think about abstractly.
Right.
You don't happen to have a concrete example you could remember from the past or come up with on the fly, do you?
Well, I guess we're looking at, so all of our administrators are also in our members database or in our table.
Okay.
And so we have to build more administrator functionality, but we don't want it to be on top of the member model. So we want to separate those out, but we can't just separate them out because all of the current administrative functionality is pointed at the member model. So like we've made copies of them, and we've made a copy of the table as we start to like separate this stuff out, because it's a lot easier than kind of re-migrating and having to migrate IDs and all this. So we just have to like change kind of the belongs to clauses, and then the IDs all match.
Yeah.
But there are certain pieces where we can't change something because it is too tightly knit to the members model instead of the new administrators model, and we're just like we're not sure what to do with that functionality, because like we could just hang on to it, but if we're trying to release it, and you said like have that the state where the functionality is present but it's not running yet, like there's a certain point where that doesn't, like, it doesn't seem like it could function anymore. Like you have to say, okay, this functionality needs to be cut here, now it's fully present and live. And it's just like, it's like, when do you do that? When do you approach that? When do you make that call that it can still be there?
Yeah. Well, one thing I can certainly say is that not every strategy works in all scenarios.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think I understand the scenario well enough to be able to comment intelligently on it. But it sounds like you have these, tell me how close I'm getting. You have these two concepts, administrator and member, and they have a certain amount of overlap. Like if you made a Venn diagram of the two, it sounds like there's this transition happening maybe where these overlapping circles are pulling apart and they're becoming a bit more distinct. Is that the idea?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's like, say there's two pegs in the middle that are keeping them from coming fully separate.
Yeah. And mechanically, what form do those take? Is that like code or database structure or what?
Mostly it's code, which like at this point, it's kind of like, we're not going to throw this over to the deployment stage because these pegs are still here and we have to get rid of them. So we're just going to not deploy and wait until we can finish those. Like, and basically we're just going to rewrite code for two separate models so that they are separated. But there's a lot of spots in the system that we have to test on the member side to make sure that we have it done properly. On the administrator side, it's not as complicated because they don't use some of that functionality. It's just baked into their model right now, right? So like there's validations around the database, there's validations around how the account gets created that we kind of just fake for the administrator. So it's easy to get rid of it for there, but like when we're changing the functionality so that it's not taking that administrative function into account, we have to kind of delete a bunch of if clauses all through the app.
I think I'm understanding it more. Do you think it could be characterized as a coupling issue?
Definitely.
Like these pegs that are, I love that part of the metaphor. The pegs that are keeping these circles from pulling apart as much as they need to are maybe instances where there's too tight of coupling. And I wonder how, and it seems like what would need to happen if this idea were to be achieved of, what is the idea we're talking about of like having both things in parallel or something like that, or having the new functionality not turned on yet or something like that, present but not turned on. It seems like that stuff would have to be decoupled as a prerequisite to that being possible, right?
Yeah.
And the current approach being taken doesn't achieve that?
I think it could. We just haven't thought about deploying what we've got right now so that it's present. Right, so there's a lot of changes, like some of them are small, but like there's 100 changes all through the application where we've removed this kind of this if clause, which is a terrible design. I understand that, but it's like if administrator or if member, right? So we looked at, okay, let's change it so that we're just changing the return of the function, right? So that it deals with it there and we don't have to change it in 100 spots. But then we're looking at that piece of code in 100 spots where it's confusing now because it's not actually checking administrator or member. We don't want that in there. So we're going through and deleting it, but we want to make sure that member still functions properly. Now, when administrator is no longer in the table, no problems, but we're not at that point, and we're not, and I don't want to just flip the switch, and say, okay, we're live, let's just go with it. So yeah, I think like I really like the idea of deploying it in small chunks and having it in there. Um, and I think that's maybe the best way to get this code in because it is a lot of little changes. So it's nice to have them in and testing them in different areas. But maybe we just have to think about doing it in pieces. So like in one section of the application, we remove 10 of those functions, and then at least those 10 are in there and they're changed and they're tested. So when you're thinking, or when I'm talking about it with you, you're kind of solidifying it in my mind.
Okay.
So
The one other comment I'll make is like in those situations where it's like there's a bunch of ifs, like if I'm this kind of thing, do this. If I'm this other kind of thing, do that. I found it, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir, but I found it can sometimes be useful to change it from an is a kind of scenario to has a, where like members and administrators could be each endowed with certain capabilities that come from some module or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, again, even though we got more concrete, it's still somewhat abstract, obviously,
Of
without
course.
looking at the code and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm hesitant to say more than that because like, people who always have an answer to everything, I think are like almost by definition like bullshitting some of the time, and I don't
Right.
want to venture into that territory.
Yeah. Well, if they have an answer all the time, they're going to be wrong some of the time. So
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so
like your client, what is
yeah.
he talking about? Like, does he have something concrete that you know about, or is he asking abstractly?
I think his question was abstract, although I'm sure he has specific
Right.
concrete
Yeah.
things in mind. Yeah. Oh, his next question reminds me of something I meant to say earlier, but I didn't. How do you do a schema change first? Do you add a new column instead of changing an existing one? If so, how do you keep the data in sync? What about updating older records to use the new schema? So the reason he asked this is because in that email I sent, I suggested kind of what we were talking about earlier before. If you have a change that requires a change to the database schema and a change to the code, you have your original state. I suggest doing a deployment that's only the schema change and nothing else, and make that schema change compatible with the original state and the state as it will be after the new code is introduced. That way, when you do a change where you have to synchronize a database schema change with a code change, that's like that's risky. And so it's good to make that less risky. And Ryan's kind of asking, how do you achieve that? And I think there's maybe a distinction that's helpful to make. So Ryan was asking, do you add a new column instead of changing an existing one? If so, how do you keep the data in sync? So the distinction that I think is helpful is the distinction between a schema change, a structure change, and a data migration. Obviously, those often go hand in hand, but I think it's helpful to think of them distinctly. And I think it's good, if possible, to do those things in separate steps. It's basically like there's almost no lower limit to how small these steps can be before it like is not smart anymore, because it's just so risky. So for those ones that involve both a structure change and a data migration, I would want to do the structure change separately from the data migration. And to answer your question directly, Ryan, if you're watching this, yes, I would add, well, it depends. But generally, yes, I would add a new column rather than changing the existing one. I have to like slow down and think about this, because when you, for example, change a column name, there's a very good chance that the change of that column name is not compatible with the current code. And so that goes back to the idea that you want to have your schema change compatible with both the original way and the way as it is with the new code introduced. And I think one way I've handled that in the past is like you add your new column with your name that you want to move to. And I'm going to get this mixed up and probably wrong a little bit, but maybe I can correct myself. You can change the code so that it's compatible with both column names. So like, I don't know, for example, you can add like a method that kind of masks the bad old name with a method that's the new name, something like that. Before I say too many incorrect things, do either of you guys have comments on this type of migration where you're like renaming a column?
I would agree. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I was going to say that the first thing I'd say is looking at like if you're changing something that has like 10 records or a million, because you're going to be more careful with bigger things. It takes longer, isn't it? All that kind of stuff. But yeah, if you have foo and you want to add bar, then you could in your code have something where it will do, where it will get bar or foo. That way, when you're kind of in that in between, you'll be able to switch and then kind of finalize it. And there's also a bunch of tools like was it Safe Migrations as one of the gems that can help you with kind of making sure they're doing the right stuff in Rails specifically. But yeah, and sometimes you need to do a code change beforehand to make them compatible with both situations. And then if you're going to really break it out, you might have to do something beforehand, your actual migration, or your additional columns or whatever, and then kind of cleaning up afterwards to get to your final state.
Yeah. I remember I had this as a job interview question once, and I don't remember if I got it right or not, or if I said it the way the guy wanted me to say it. But it's like, I'm smart enough to figure out how to do it when I'm doing it. I don't know if I'm smart enough to like think of how to do it right off the top of my head. But the general idea is again that parallelism. And then the data migration itself. That's a good point about like, is it just like 10 records or is it like a million? My brain is starting to hurt, and so I don't know if I can address that one. Do you have anything to say about that one, Jonathan?
I would lean pretty there's if you do any looking at blog posts with Safe Migrations, Rails, that type of stuff, you'll find there's lots of stuff that's been written about it. But the big things are stuff where if you are doing a large migration where you're doing a lot of stuff with data manipulation, the big thing is looking at what's going to be locking the database. And that's where you so if you have something where if you're renaming a field that has a million records and it's going to be locking it, then that's where you would do something where you add the new field. And if you have a situation where like it shouldn't be null, for example, that's where you could do stuff with like if you're on Postgres, you do check constraints. That way you can have a null field that's not allowed to be null in that in between phase. So there's some stuff like that where if you get into like specifics of what your migration is, then that's where you want to do some of those types of things. But if you look into it, there's lots of good documentation on the like specific issues you'd run into. And it's usually going to be around things like null fields, referential integrity, and big data sets.
As you were talking, Jonathan, I remembered how I used to do it at my old job. It's not always possible, but I would perform data migrations in the middle of the night when nobody was using the system. And
that's a great method.
Yeah. As an extra precaution, I would turn the system completely off and like replace it with a, we're doing maintenance right now message, so that I could be sure that no data manipulation was happening during that period of time. Turn it off, back up the database, whatever, perform the migration, do whatever tests I needed to do to feel confident that everything went right, and then turn the system back on. And then, sleep until 11 a.m. or whatever. But that worked out well. If your system is like 24/7 always on, can't have any maintenance downtime, then that's a different story. But if you can have a little bit of downtime, then that's a good way to do it, I think.
Well, that should probably be kind of as a meta comment for everything we're talking about. We can over engineer and architect tons and tons of stuff to really make robust systems that we don't need. So if you can put it as maintenance mode, then yeah, like don't do all the other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that bears some comment. I think it's like a very legitimate and realistic and good answer to a lot of these questions. Like, how do you do X? Well, maybe just don't do that. And I think a lot of businesses, developers, teams, whatever, they get themselves into trouble by saying yes to too many things. I think 37 Signals is a great example of an organization that has built a culture of not saying yes to too many things, not biting off more than they can chew, and aggressively saying no and keeping things simple. And that just makes everything easier from a technical perspective. Okay. Fairly different question. Something I mentioned in the email I had sent was regarding immutable infrastructure. So the idea that I had described was, instead of having a deployment where I'll make the example simple. Like, let's say you have a single server, you run a deployment, and it replaces your files on your server with new files, and that's how your deployment works. A lot of people have done it that way for a long time, and that works out fine a lot of the time, but maybe not all the time. And the way we did it at my last job was, we had virtual servers, and instead of replacing the code on an existing server, we would have a new server created that had the new code on it, still maintain the old servers. After the new server was created with the new code, there were some health checks performed on it. And if the health checks were successful, we would start routing traffic to that new server. If everything was still good, we would stop routing traffic to the old servers, and those would gradually fall away. So it was like, I don't know, it's like on a boat when you're moving about, you always have 3 points of contact, which is, it gives you more stability than if you're just walking around. And so that's kind of analogous to that, where it's like, you're not just jumping from one thing to the other, you're like always have your feet on the ground or whatever. I don't know if I successfully navigated that metaphor, but hopefully the idea comes across. And I was being kind of loose and sloppy with my terminology there. We used Kubernetes at my last job. So to be more technically correct or whatever, we had nodes. When we did a deployment with Kubernetes, it would, we had nodes and pods. All these details probably aren't very important, but we would spin up new pods, stop routing traffic to the old pods and stuff like that. My point there is just the technical way that we achieved those things was with Kubernetes. Yeah, I think that addresses Ryan's question. Any comments from you guys about that stuff?
Jason, how big was the team there? Like, were you managing Kubernetes, or was there like a dedicated system person doing Kubernetes?
No, for a long time, I was the only programmer in the organization. And at our peak, we had a total of 3 devs. And
Okay.
by the time I left, it was just me and one other guy. And it might sound like Kubernetes was overkill for what we were doing, but I thought it actually fit quite well. And even though the initial setup was painful, mostly due to my own inexperience, once it was set up, it was pretty much zero maintenance.
Hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, that's all of Ryan's questions. So obviously we talked about a lot of like really technical stuff specifically around deployment and stuff like that. We have maybe about 10 minutes left, so I'll try to wrap up. There's a lot of technical stuff. But these again are all things that I think about from the very beginning, because how you deploy changes and how you plan how you're going to technically achieve the changes again are not really separable from the business concerns. And so I think about both those things, like how are the business desires going to affect the technical aspects, and how are the technical aspects going to impact the business desires, and how can we make compromises on either end that will make the other part easier. Having said all that, anything we want to spend these last 10 minutes or so talking about? Something I was talking with my other consulting client with recently that I certainly hope to talk about more is the very early stages of planning a project in terms of the UI and all that stuff. I like to plan the UI first, and from the UI comes the specifications, and then from the specifications come tests, and then the tests lead to code and all that stuff. But obviously we can get into all that in a future session.
What tool do you
Yeah.
use to quickly plan the UI, other than like pen and paper?
Yeah, my favorite's pen and paper.
Yeah.
One of my favorite work situations I've ever had was I worked on site. I was responsible for the data entry system that this data entry team of about 20 people used. And I would just draw on pen and paper and like walk over to their area of the office, and we would do usability testing together. And once we had something that was solid and the defects had been ferreted out by the usability testing process, then I would convert those designs into working software. We would do additional rounds of usability testing on the actual software. And then by the time it was deployed and in users' hands, there was never a case where we had built the wrong thing, because it wasn't news to the people who were seeing it. They weren't seeing it for the first time. They had been involved in the design process the entire time.
What happens if you have a remote team and you can't just walk over and pen and paper show them?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because that's
Okay.
harder. I've used one tool I like is Balsamiq, which lets you
Yep.
create like really lo-fi designs.
Yeah.
Um,
That's still around.
yeah,
Yeah, it's great.
yeah, and it's intentionally lo-fi because I was explaining to my client, they make it kind of cartoony, and the reason they do that is so when you show somebody, they don't think you're almost done. They understand very clearly that it's just a rough sketch. And frankly, at a lot of the jobs I've worked at, they haven't been really into the usability testing idea, which makes me a bit sad, because I think that's really leaving an opportunity on the table. I think it's a lot more efficient to plan a UI via usability testing and then build it, rather than build it in software and take all that time and expense and then discover that it's not quite on the mark and have to redo it. That's a lot more expensive. but it seems more expensive to go through all that usability testing. But what I would do if I was allowed to is make those designs, and then if I could, well, one of two things. Perform usability testing with somebody who's representative of a user, even if they're not an actual user. Sometimes you can find somebody close enough. Like if it's a consumer app, you can almost just use anybody. But like, for example, at my last job, what I would like to have done, but was never, maybe I don't know if I wasn't allowed to, but what I never actually did was I wanted to like just fly to the office and do that pen and paper usability testing. Yeah, I don't think that would have flown. I never felt comfortable trying it, but that's what I would do. It's expensive to fly somewhere and do all that stuff, but I think it's better again than building all the software and having to change it.
Yeah. Sometimes we've used just HTML mockups. So like a sketch is good, but some of our users like they have a hard time picturing it like with our assets and our style and everything. So it's like, well, you gotta work with us a little bit here, but we could do like plain static HTML where it's not, there's no design behind it, there's no code behind it. It's just, here's at least you can see our menu buttons and this is what it's going to look like, and is this good enough?
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a little less expensive, like you're not creating all the software, but you're able to actually see what it looks like to show the use. Like I'm not a designer, so this is our best guess, and it's worked out pretty well. But yeah, I'm still searching for a tool where you can quickly import your assets and your style guide a little bit and then just like drag and drop like Balsamiq, right?
Well, somebody's probably cooking up some AI.
It's probably out there, I just haven't found it yet.
Yeah,
like some people said Canva, and I can't remember what the other one was.
Oh yeah, there's definitely like remote usability testing tools, but I've never used any of those, never sought them out or anything. Yeah, all right, well, I think that's some pretty good ground that we covered today. Thanks guys for joining me for this, and yeah, let's I'll plan to do another session on planning, and we can cover some different areas of the planning process. But thanks guys, and I will see you next time.
Thanks, Jason. Bye everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks.